Cargo Gate 9 opened for something that was not on the manifest, and Chief Sealkeeper Elaine Vex watched it happen live on 4 monitors at once without believing a single one of them. The gate was rated against glass squalls that could plane the paint off a hauler. It did not open for weather, for pleading, or for rank. It opened at 0941 Station Bright for a dark shape the size of a cargo sled that walked through the gap at an unhurried, diagonal as if the most heavily defended door on the planet Barrow were a curtain in a kitchen. Vex had her hand on the override before the shape cleared the threshold. The override told her the gate was closed. The gate, visibly open on every feed, disagreed. Quarantine arch, she said into the duty channel very evenly, because a chief who shouted taught her whole watch to shout, seal it now, manual bar if you have to. The quarantine arch was already cycling, not breached, not forced. Cycling, politely, in proper sequence, inner seal waiting for outer seal, pressure light green, the way it cycled for a licensed medical gurney, and for nothing else in the world. The dark shape passed under the arch at the same unhurried walk, and the 2 duty wardens stationed there pressed themselves against the wall with their shock staves held out like men offering umbrellas to a landslide. On the close feed, Vex finally saw it whole, and her temple membranes went tight against her skull. It was an animal. Earthstock. She had seen the file images every sealkeeper memorized and prayed never to need. Canid, but built like a draft engine, black as lock grease, standing taller at the shoulder than the seated wardens it passed. One ear was a torn flag. A scar crossed its shoulder like a badly healed weld seam. Its ribs showed. It did not look left. It did not look right. It walked through her habitat's second most defended door, trailing storm dust off its coat in little gray threads. And the third door, the Plaza Iris, the ceremonial one, the one that stood open only on festival mornings and had not seen a festival in 11 years, began with a groan of unused servos to dilate. Who is opening my doors? Vex said still evenly. It was not a question anymore. It was an inventory of her morning. Nobody, Chief, her deputy said. Onik was Vasisek, young, broad as a bulkhead and earnest as a first-day cadet, and his voice had gone up half an octave. Nobody is opening anything. The system says all 3 are shut. The system is looking at the same feed I am, and it says, Chief, it says seal integrity 100%. Then the system and I will be having a conversation, Vex said. Where does the iris let out? She knew where the iris let out. She asked because some part of her wanted one more second before the answer became real. The iris let out onto Suncage Plaza at mid-morning on a market day. Suncage Terrace was a sealed habitat of 9,000 souls on a world whose weather could skin a vehicle, and its plaza at mid-morning was the closest thing the colony had to a heartbeat. Ferment row matrons arguing over crock prices, duplicate bakers ferrying kiln trays, Vasek stevedores on shift break, 3 deep at the tea counter. Sender clerks, offram growers, the school children cutting through against every posted rule. 400 bodies easily between the iris and the fountain. The animal walked into the middle of all of them. Vex would watch the recording many times in the weeks that followed, and the thing that never stopped impressing her was the speed of the emptying. It was not a stampede the way drills imagine stampedes, with choke points and trampling. It was faster than that and stranger than that. The crowd did not flee the animal so much as the plaza appeared to evaporate around it. Radially, like oil flinching from a hot pan, stalls abandoned mid-transaction, a kiln tray of seed cakes left steaming on a rail, a stevedore vaulting a fountain rim he could not have cleared on a wager. In 11 seconds, she would count later, frame by frame, 400 people compressed themselves into doorways and side lanes and left the heart of the colony to a starving black dog, size of a market stall. 11 seconds. And then the plaza was still, and the animal stood alone in the bright fall of dome-filtered daylight, and Vex was already moving, taking the warden stair 3 steps at a time with Onyx boots hammering behind her. By the time she reached the plaza arcade, the animal had stopped walking. It stood at the fountain's south rim, head low, perfectly still, looking at something. Vex followed the line of its gaze across 40 meters of abandoned market and felt her morning already break in a new direction. Not everyone had run. A human child sat alone on the south bench, girl-shaped, small even by human measures, with a gray lunch tin open on her knees and her boots not quite reaching the ground. Vex knew her by file the way she knew every resident by file. Etta Park, 9 Earth years, daughter of Imra Park, glass-line welder, night shift. Contract row. The human enclave numbered 41 and had exactly 1 child in it, and that child ate alone on the south bench every market morning, in the one spot the plaza's social currents never touched, with the particular stillness of a person who has learned that no one is coming to sit down. She had not run because, Vex understood this later from the recording, she had not looked up in time. She had been looking at her lunch. The plaza had emptied around her with the silence of a held breath, and when Etta Park finally raised her head, The colony was gone, and the largest land predator within 4 light-years was crossing the flagstones toward her at a walk. "Hold," Vex said on the wide channel to the 6 wardens now ringing the arcade with weapons half-raised. "Hold, no discharge. There is a resident in the field of fire." Her own sidearm stayed down, 40 meters. She would not cross it in time, and a running seal keeper would either spook the animal or teach it that this place was prey, and she did not intend to do either. Nobody breathes. The dog reached the bench. It was taller sitting than the child was standing. The recording would show its shadow falling over her entire body, lunch tin and all. The plaza was so quiet that the fountain's recycler pump could be heard ticking. In the doorways, 400 residents watched through shop glass, and on the arcade 6 wardens held their breath around lighted weapons, and Sealkeeper Elaine Vex stood at the rank rail with her hand cramping on a sidearm she had not raised, watching a 9-year-old look up the full height of the thing the whole colony had fled. Etta Park looked at the dog. The dog looked at Etta Park. Then it sat down beside the bench, folded itself down joint by joint, enormous, deliberate, settling at her side with its scarred shoulder a hand's width from her sleeve, and faced outward, toward the plaza, toward the wardens, toward everything in the world that was not her, exactly the way the carved sentinels sat flanking the old festival doors. It sat down beside the loneliest resident in Sunkage Terrace, as if it had crossed 3 impossible doors and 400 fleeing strangers, specifically to report for that duty. And Etta Park, daughter of the night shift, 9 years old, alone on her bench for the 200th market morning in a row, looked at the monster the colony had run from. Vex was near enough now, edging the arcade rail, to see the child's face do something it had not done in any file image it opened, as if a door in it had been waiting like the iris, for the one thing it was built for. Etta took the sandwich out of her lunch tin, tore it in half with great care, and held the bigger half out sideways. "You eat like my mum," the girl said. Her voice carried across the whole stone-quiet plaza. "Standing guard over it. You can stop that. Nobody here takes food." The dog took the half sandwich from her hand so gently that the recording, zoomed to maximum, showed the child's fingers never moving. Behind Vex, one of the wardens made a sound like a valve failing. Somewhere in the arcade, a teacup, set down badly on a rail, rang once against the stone. And in the doorways of Sunkage Plaza, 400 residents who had not voluntarily shared a room in 11 years stood shoulder to shoulder in the shadows, watching a human child feed half her lunch to a Deathworld animal, every one of them packed close enough to feel their neighbors breathe. Vex noticed that part even then. She wished afterward she could say she hadn't. It would have made everything that followed so much easier to be wrong about from the start. The standoff lasted 2 hours and ended in the only way that left everyone alive and nobody honest. Containment doctrine for unregistered Earth fauna was 4 lines long, and Vex had written 3 of them. Isolate, restrain, hold for disposition. Do not approach without Class 5 barriers. The colony owned 2 Class 5 barrier frames. Both, when Onik ran for them, turned out to have been cannibalized for storm shutter parts 6 years ago, because Sunkage Terrace had never once needed to contain anything larger than a crate rat, and lockers full of unused equipment lose arguments with weather every time. So Vex improvised by the book in the order the book demanded. A cordon, established at a radius the animal ignored. A capture loop on a 6-meter pole, deployed by a sweating warden who got within 4 meters before the dog turned its head and looked at him, only looked, and the warden discovered that his legs had voted against the rest of his career. A veterinary sedation dart, fired from the arcade rail at Vex's own order, her own thumb on the authorization, a clean hit in the haunch. The dog glanced at the dart the way a dockhand glances at light rain, lay down beside the bench with a sigh that stirred the dust off the flagstones, and did not so much as blink slower. The dosage chart, Onik reported in a whisper, went up to 40 kilograms. The animal was, he made an estimating motion with both hands, gave up, not 40 kilograms. Through all of it, the child would not leave. That was the part the doctrine had no line for. Imra Park arrived from the night shift dormitories at a dead run, hair flat on one side, terror making her fast, and stopped at the cordon like everyone else, because her daughter was inside it, sitting on the bench with her hand resting on a sleeping giant's torn ear. And the daughter said, in the reasonable tone of a person explaining the obvious, "If I leave, he'll follow me. He picked me. You don't run off when you get picked." "Etta," her mother said, with the whole plaza listening. "Sweetheart, it's a wild animal." "He's not wild," Etta said. "He's stray. It's different. Wild means you never had anybody." She looked down at the gray head under her hand, at the weld-seam scar at the ribs. "Stray means you remember." Vex stood 3 meters away inside her own cordon against her own doctrine, and listened to a 9-year-old define the word that would eat the next season of her life, and wrote it down that evening exactly as spoken, because a seal keeper records what the incident contained, and the incident had contained that. At hour 2, the dog solved the standoff itself. It woke, stood the cordon, took a collective step backward. The dog declined to notice, touched its nose once to the child's hair with a gravity that silenced the arcade and walked away, back across the plaza, back under the plaza iris, which dilated for it, back through the quarantine arch, which cycled for it, back out cargo gate 9, which swung wide before it like an opinion the habitat had been waiting to express, and shut behind it, and reported to every sensor on the network that it had never opened at all. 3 doors, 3 impossible doors, twice in one day, in both directions. Vex stood in her ops room that evening and looked at the integrity board, all green, all lying, and felt something she had not felt in 11 years of perfect seals. The floor of her certainty move a millimeter underfoot. "Orders, Chief?" Onik asked. "Open a file," she said. "Incident File 77. Subject Canid, Earthstock, unregistered, designation pending. Log the door anomalies under habitat integrity. Priority 1. Log the animal under threat assessment." She watched the plaza feed a moment longer. The market had refilled the moment the gate shut, but wrong, she noticed, or rather not wrong, different. Knots of residents who never spoke stood overlapping each other's territory, arguing about the same 2 hours. Ferment Row and Kiln Row, who had not exchanged a civil word since the flower fire, were jabbing fingers at the same patch of empty flagstone, reconstructing the animal's path. The Vasek tea counter had humans at it. 11 years she had watched that plaza sort itself into enclaves like sediment settling, every species and grievance to its own stratum, and one starving trespasser had stirred the whole tank in an afternoon. "And the girl?" Onik said. "Threat assessment puts an interaction flag on her, standard form, contact with unassessed fauna. It goes on her record, Chief. She's 9. Vex looked at the last freeze frame, the torn half sandwich, the small steady hand. "Log the girl as a witness," she said. "The form can argue with me when it learns to open doors." She believed that first night that she had a security problem, a breach problem, an animal problem, a problem with edges she could cordon. She opened File 77 the way she opened every file of her career, intending to close it. It would run to 91 entries. It would outlive her threat assessment, her cordons, and very nearly her colony, and the last entry would be written in her own hand on a morning when the plaza was full and the doors were open and nobody. She would check the recording, frame by frame, out of old habit. Nobody was standing apart from anybody at all. But that came later. First came the doors, and the doors made no sense at all. The engineering review took 4 days and produced the kind of answer that engineers deliver with their eyes down. Cargo Gate 9, the Quarantine Arch, and the Plaza Iris shared a 40-year-old safety subroutine, written when Sunkage Terrace was a Med-Frontier outpost. Any mass profile matching a loaded medical gurney, slow, heavy, steady, low to the ground, approaching on the center line at a constant pace, triggered priority passage, no credentials required, and suppressed the open door alarm so as not to panic a casualty. The subroutine predated the colony. It predated the modern sensor grid, which had been layered over it like paint over a hinge. Nothing else on Barrow moved slow enough, heavy enough, and steady enough to wake it. Nothing, it turned out, except 103 kilograms of Earth Canid walking with the patience of a creature that had crossed worse rooms than this. 1. It didn't break in, the gate engineer said, membranes flat with professional distress. "Chief, that's the finding. It walked in the one way our own doors are built to allow. It found a 40-year-old kindness in the wiring, and it used it. 3 doors in sequence. The odds of stumbling on that gate pattern by accident are not odds," Vex said, "are learning. It watched the gurneys, it paced them. Something out in the service tiers has been studying how this colony opens." She wrote it in File 77, Entry 4, in the dry idiom of her trade. "Subject defeats Lock Row 3 via legitimate protocol exploitation. No damage, no alarm. Method indicates extended observation of habitat logistics from concealment. Estimate subject has resided within service infrastructure for an extended period, undetected, despite continuous sensor coverage." Then she sat looking at the last line she had written, because a chief should read her own reports as an enemy would, and the enemy's question was obvious. Undetected by sensors that also missed 3 door cycles in broad daylight. What else is the grid not seeing? She put the question in the file. Entry 5, 1 line, no answer. It sat there patient as the dog for 90 days. The colony, meanwhile, wanted the animal dead, and said so in the manner Sunkage Terrace said everything, separately, by faction, in writing, with no 2 complaints filed through the same office. The Dewlett Bakers Guild petitioned the provisioner. Ferment Row petitioned the land office, mostly to avoid agreeing with the Bakers. The Vasek Stevedores Union lodged a workplace hazard grievance. The Sender Clerks Association cited statute. 11 years of practiced estrangement meant colony could not even panic together, and Vex, reading the stack, was struck by the unwelcome thought that the stack itself was the truest map of her home anyone had drawn in a decade. 9,000 residents, 6 governing offices, 41 humans, 1 plaza nobody crossed diagonally because a diagonal would take them through somebody else's grief. Sunkage Terrace had not always been sealed this way on the inside. There had been festivals once. The Plaza Iris had the servoware to prove it. There had been intermarried rows and a mixed choir and a market you could not hear yourself think in. What there had been 11 years ago was the East Lock breach, year 14 of the colony, a glass squall, a seal that failed where 9 people were working, and no bodies to bury because the wind on Barrow does not return what it takes. The inquiry had needed someone to carry it, and it had chosen the then chief sealkeeper, a sender named Davarun. Negligent calibration, the finding read, stripped of warrant. He had not left the colony, there was nowhere to leave to, he had simply gone down, into the service tiers, and the colony had closed over him like water. And then slowly, factions blaming factions for whose rigging, whose shift roster, whose inspection had really failed, it had closed over itself. Vex had been his cadet. She had testified truthfully, precisely, fatally, that the calibration logs bore his seal. She was 26 then, she was 37 now, and she had built her career and her colony's whole security doctrine on a single load-bearing certainty. The instruments are honest, and the failure was a man. File 77 did not care about her certainties. File 77 was about a dog. She told herself that for an impressively long time. The disposition ruling, when she forced the 6 offices to share a table long enough to produce one, landed exactly where she had aimed it. The animal was Earth fauna, and Earth fauna fell under the human residency contract, and the human residency contract assigned liability for companion animals to their registered owner. The animal had no registered owner. It was in law nobody's, and a thing that is nobody's cannot be summarily destroyed under colony statute. It can only be excluded, contained, or claimed. The cull petitions died in the gap between jurisdictions, 6 offices each politely declining to be the one that paid for the dart. You built that gap, Onyx said afterward, not quite a question, carrying the ruling back to Ops. Chief, you walked 6 offices into deadlock on purpose. I applied procedure, Vex said. You applied it the way Mum applies a crowbar. Right up the cordon roster, Vex said. But she wrote entry 9 that night herself and let the file see what she would not say in the corridor. Disposition deferred indefinitely. Subject remains at large in service tiers. Note, subject has made no aggressive contact. Subject has, to date, opened 3 doors, emptied 1 plaza, and fed 1 child. Threat assessment holds it pending. Keeper's addendum. Pending what, exactly? The assessing officer would very much like to know. The animal, for its part, declined to remain a hypothetical. It came back on the 6th day, through the same 3 doors, at the same unhurried walk, except that this time the duty wardens had standing orders to shadow, not engage, and the plaza, warned by the gate klaxon Vex had rigged to the gurney subroutine, emptied in a more orderly fashion that was somehow less honest than the first panic. 400 people pretending to flee calmly, peering from doorways. 1 child not pretending anything, already on her bench, lunch tin already open, half sandwich already torn. You came back, Etta Park said, loud in the empty plaza as the shadow fell over her. Okay, good. I told them you would. Nobody believes me about anything, so this is excellent for my reputation. The dog sat, outward-facing, sentinel still. The girl ate her half of the sandwich, and the giant ate its half, and around the rim of Sunkage Plaza 9 species watched through glass. And Vex stood at the arcade rail with her arms folded, watching a colony watch a child be unafraid. On the 7th day, Imra Park filed a form no office on Barrow had ever processed. An application to register a companion animal, species canid. Name, the clerk had queried it twice. Name latch. He opens doors, Etta explained to the clerk, who had not asked, and would repeat the explanation for years. And he closes behind him. A latch holds things shut, but it's also the only part that lets you in. Mum says that's too much name for a dog. I say he's too much dog for less. Vex read the registration that evening, appended it to file 77, and noted entry 11 dry as dust, that her unregistered subject now had a name, a registered owner of record, a feeding schedule posted on contract row, and a legal existence she herself had accidentally architected. The threat assessment box on the file cover still read pending. She looked at it for a while, she left it that way. She was not soft. She wanted that understood, later by whoever audited the file. Every entry of those first weeks ends in the same hand, the same discipline. Cordon maintained, shadow detail assigned, engagement prohibited, anomalies logged. She watched the animal the way she watched weather, without affection, without hatred, with total attention, because it had walked through her seals as if they were suggestions, and a thing that can do that is a thing you study until you understand it, or it ruins you. What she could not have known in those first weeks was the shape the studying would take. Incident File 77, open to document a breach, was about to become something no security instrument on Barrow had ever been. A ledger of repairs, a map entry by entry, incident by incident, of every wall inside Sunkage Terrace that one scarred stray was going to lean on until it gave drawn-up in evidence format, signed and dated by the one officer in the colony whose whole life was walls. Entry 12 was the baker's. The flower fire deserves its history told straight, because everything Latch did afterward only makes sense against it. 6 years before the dog, a kiln on the Dewlett Baker's Row had flashed over during a delivery from Ferment Row's grain stores. The fire took 2 stalls, a seasoned stock, and the eyebrows of a baker named Hada Brim, who emerged from the smoke carrying her starter culture like an infant and pointing across the lane. Ferment Row's matriarch, an offram grower named Grell Soon, had pointed straight back. Damp grain breeds heat, said the bakers. The growers shipped it wet. Kilns vented badly, said the growers. The bakers ran them blind. The insurance arbitration ended in a draw that satisfied nobody, and for 6 years the 2 rows that had once made the colony's bread between them, growers fermenting and milling on one side of Sunkage Plaza, bakers proofing and firing on the other, had not traded so much as a sack. The bakers bought off-world flour at off-world prices. The growers sold their grain to the protein vats. The colony's bread got worse, and everyone agreed it was worth it. On a bright 4th day morning, with the dome panels throwing clean noon light down across the market, Latch walked out of the service stair behind Kiln Row, nobody ever did find, which grate he used, and stole Hada Brim's proofing cloth, not the bread. Vex reviewed the footage exhaustively, because the distinction turned out to matter to everyone involved. The proofing cloth, 4 generations old, carried from the Dewlett homeworld, the linen seasoned with a century of cultures, the single most sacred object on Baker's Row, and to a dog, apparently, the best-smelling thing on the planet. Latch took it off the proofing rail with the delicacy of a surgeon, draped it over his own back like a parade blanket, and walked, never ran. The file is explicit. The animal did not run diagonally across Sunkage Plaza through the social membrane no resident had crossed in 6 years, and lay down in the mouth of Ferment Row's grain alley, wearing it. What followed was recorded by 11 separate shop cameras, and Vex's official summary of it, Entry 12, is a model of institutional restraint. Subject relocated Dewlett ceremonial property to Offram commercial frontage, declining to release same. Both factions pursued. Confrontation ensued. What ensued was Hada Brim, flour to the elbows, standing in the mouth of an alley she had sworn never to enter, screaming at a dog that outweighed her twice over, while the dog looked at her with what every witness independently described as polite attention, lying on the cloth's trailing end so that pulling it risked tearing it. Grell soon arrived with half her row behind her to demand the cloth and the dog and the baker get off her frontage in any order whatsoever. The 2 matriarchs, suddenly a meter apart for the first time since the arbitration, conducted their argument over the dog's back. The dog wagged once at each raised voice, slow, metronomic the way he received all weather, and did not move. He did not move for 2 hours. Vex's shadow detail, under orders not to engage, stood at the alley mouth and watched a hostage negotiation conducted by a hostage taker who wanted, as far as anyone could establish, nothing. It was Etta Park who broke it, because of course it was. The school released for mid-meal. The girl crossed the emptied plaza at a run. Residents had learned by then that the plaza emptied for Latch, and watched from the rim with the attentiveness of a colony that had stopped pretending it had anywhere better to be, ducked under the cordon. Vex had specifically rated for adults, and stopped in front of the dog with her hands on her hips, a meter of child auditing a meter and a half of dog. "You can't take things," she told him. "We talked about this. You're embarrassing me in front of the government." The government, Vex, at the cordon, kept her face still with some effort. "He won't tear it," Etta said then, to the 2 matriarchs, in the matter-of-fact register that adults kept mistaking for cheek. "He carries everything soft. He carried a glass lamp once. He just wants you to come get it." She looked from Brim to Soon and back with a child's terrible clarity. "Both of you. He could have taken it anywhere. He took it here." There was a silence of a particular quality, later attested by all witnesses. "That is absurd," Hada Brim said. "It is an animal. It does not arrange things." "Okay," Etta said, supremely unbothered, in the tone of a person who had been not believed her whole life and stopped billing for it. "Then both of you come get the cloth off the animal." They came, Brim because the cloth was hers, Soon because the alley was, and what happened next went into File 77 in the kind of detail no security instrument needed, and Vex recorded anyway. The 2 matriarchs knelt at either end of one length of century-old linen, working it out from under a dog who lifted each limb cooperatively as required, and at some point during the unwinding Grell Soon said quietly, professionally, despite herself, This seasoning, you can smell the malt in it. Is that the old Northfield barley? And Hannah Brim said, equally despite herself, it was. There hasn't been Northfield barley in 6 years. The vats take it all. Latch's tail thumped the flagstones twice. The cloth came free without a torn thread. Brim folded it with soon, the way one folds a sheet with the person across from you, 4 hands in an old rhythm, and the dog watched, and the plaza watched, and Vex watched, and then the two of them stood in the alley mouth in the bright noon, holding a folded square of linen between them, with nowhere left to put their fury. The arbitration, soon said at last, is settled. The lane is open. If your kilns want grain that isn't VAT grade, the grain exists. The kilns, Brim said, want it. A pause with 6 years in it. Proofed bread takes a day. Tell your row there will be loaves on the rail by close if they come carry them. We will not deliver. Another pause. Yet. That evening the dome lights had cycled to amber, and Vex stood at the ops window and watched something the colony had not seen since breach year. A line. A queue, mixed species, snaking across the plaza's forbidden diagonal from Ferment Row's gate to Kiln Row's rail, for bread that smelled the way the colony's old-timers kept telling everyone bread used to smell. Onik came back from the end of it with a loaf under each arm and an expression of Vasek bliss. You want to write this one up, Chief? He asked. Or should I? Because I genuinely do not know what offense to log. Log it as recovered property, Vex said, and then, because the file deserved honesty, append faction reconciliation, Ferment Row and Kiln Row, 6 years standing. Mechanism. She watched the queue not be a set of enclaves. Mechanism. Subject. It was the first time the word reconciliation appeared in Incident File 77. It would not be the last, and Vex, rereading the entry before she sealed it, understood that her file had just developed a second subject and that she did not have a form for it, and that she was going to keep writing it down anyway, because the alternative was pretending her instruments saw everything, and she had 3 doors' worth of evidence that they did not. The school incident, entry 17, was smaller and cut deeper. Sunkage Terrace ran 1 school, mixed species by necessity, segregated by habit. 9 species, 9 lunch clusters, a seating chart enforced by no rule and broken by no one. Etta Park ate at the chart's edge, at the end of a bench of sender children who were not unkind to her. Vex pulled the welfare reviews. Nobody was ever unkind to her. They simply spoke to each other in Temple Flicker half the time, as sender children do, and a human child cannot flicker. And loneliness rarely needs anyone's cruelty. It only needs everyone's habit. On a gray light morning, dome panels dimmed under high cloud, the plaza the color of brushed steel. Latch walked into the schoolyard at mid-meal. The yard had a fence. The fence had a gate. The gate this once had been latched, and the file records, with what Vex privately considered the dog's signature, that he did not jump it, though he plainly could have. He lay down outside it and looked through the bars at the yard, at 400 children sorted into their 9 clusters, until a teacher made the mistake of opening the gate to shoo him off, and then he was inside, unhurried, crossing the yard through a sea of frozen children, to Etta's bench, where he sat down beside her, outward-facing, sentinel still. And the chart broke. It broke child first, the way Vex would learn all of it broke. A Dulit boy, 7, fearless the way only the smallest are, name of Pimbrim, grand-nephew of a baker who had lately resumed speaking to Ferment Row, left his cluster, crossed the unmarked borders of 3 others, and asked Etta Park the question no adult in the colony had thought to ask her in 2 years of residency. Does he let people touch the torn ear, or is it private? You have to ask him, Etta said. Hold your hand out flat first. It's manners. Pimbrim held his hand out flat. Latch regarded it, then lowered the ruin of his ear into the boy's palm with the condescension of an emperor accepting a petition, and the yard, the whole sorted, charted, 11 years frozen yard, folded inward around the bench like a tide coming in. Sender children flickering madly. Vasek children asking the weight of him, the height of him, whether he had eaten anyone, whether he might. An Offram girl producing from her lunch tin a fermented thing that the file describes only as acquired by subject with enthusiasm. Etta Park at the center of it, fielding questions about manners and ears and what stray means, visibly unsure what to do with the experience of being the room's expert, doing it anyway. The teachers called it a security incident and called Vex. Vex arrived, assessed the scene. 40 children in a heap around a Deathworld apex predator who was at that moment lying on his back with his paws folded like a debutante, and made the second most consequential disposition ruling of her career. The animal is registered to a resident household, she said, and the yard gate was opened by staff. No breach has occurred. She let her gaze travel over the wreckage of the seating chart. The 9 clusters scrambled into one, no breach of any kind. The third most consequential ruling came that same week, when the parents began to arrive. They arrived because their children came home talking about the dog, and about the human girl who was the dog's interpreter, and 9 species of parent discovered simultaneously that their children were conducting foreign relations without a license. The school called a guardians' assembly to discuss the animal question. 200 adults attended. The school had not drawn 200 adults to anything since the breach year, and they came intending to argue about safety, and did at volume in one room, factions who had spent a decade ensuring they never occupied one room. Vex attended in uniform to present the security file. She stood at the lectern with File 77 open to the threat assessment page, looked out at the assembly, at Brim and Soon bickering in the same row, at a Vasek crane foreman and a human freight clerk, who had famously not shared a corridor since the crane day accident, jammed shoulder to shoulder in the standing rear. At Imra Park, dead center in her night shift coverall, daring the room, and gave testimony she had not planned. The subject has been inside the perimeter on 19 occasions, she said. He has defeated every physical barrier this office maintains. He has never damaged property, with one exception, which was returned folded. A noise moved through the room that was not quite laughter. It had too much disbelief in it. He has never threatened a resident. I am the colony's threat assessor. I am telling this assembly that I cannot assess him as a threat, and that I have stopped trying to, and the reason I have stopped trying to is on page 1 of my own file. She turned the file around and held it up, the way she would one day hold it up in a much worse room. Page 1 is a plaza emptying in 11 seconds. 400 of us ran from him on sight. The one resident who didn't run is 9 years old, and what she got for not running, this office is still counting. She closed the file. Assembly's question is whether the animal is safe around children. I am on record. Likeliest hazard is trampling by other children. Office recommends the Assembly's actual question, which it is welcome to debate now that it is finally all in one room. Why it took a stray dog to get it here. She stepped down into a silence with weight to it. The Assembly debated for 3 hours. It resolved in the end nothing about the dog. A subcommittee was formed. In Vex's experience, the formation of a subcommittee was a colony's way of agreeing to keep meeting, which she noted, entry 19, was itself unprecedented. But it resolved almost by accident 2 other things. The school seating chart was abolished by guardian petition, 9 factions co-signing a single document for the first time in 11 years. And the Assembly Hall's booking ledger, blank for a decade outside mandatory sessions, came away with 4 new entries. The choir question, exploratory, the festival question, preliminary, the dock canteen question, contentious, and a 4th booking, made quietly at the clerk's window after the hall emptied, by the widow Gilda Soto of Lantern Stair for the use of the small room 2 persons, purpose not stated. Vex appended the booking ledger to File 77. By then she had stopped pretending the file was about a breach. She had started carrying it differently too, not under her arm like a charge sheet but flat against her chest, like a thing that needed keeping warm. And Anik noticed and had the sense not to say so. Entry 22 was the crane. The crane day accident was the colony's 2nd oldest wound, and unlike the flower fire, it had blood in it. 4 years back, a Vasek-operated gantry crane on the freight apron had dropped a 9-ton container, 40 centimeters, only 40. The file measurements were exact, and 40 centimeters of 9 tons had been enough to take the lower leg of a human rigger named Tomas Abel, who survived and walked now on a printed limb, and had not set foot on the apron since. The union inquiry blamed human rigging, a sling set wrong. The human enclave's counterfiling blamed the crane, a brake worn past tolerance. The arbiter, off-world by relay, split liability evenly, which both sides received as an insult, and Contract Row had boycotted the dock canteen for 4 years, and the Vasek crews had let them. And the freight apron ran with 2 parallel sign-out sheets, 2 tool cribs, and 2 silences. Latch went up the crane on a windless bright day afternoon, and the colony's best guess, then and forever, was the smell of the operator's lunch tin, abandoned on the gantry platform during shift change. The service ladder's cage was built generous for Vasek shoulders. The climb, for a creature that had taught itself 3 pressure doors, was apparently nothing. What mattered was that at the top of it, 22 meters above the apron deck, the platform's inspection hatch swung shut behind him in the crosswind, and Latch, 103 kilograms of dog on a grated steel shelf the size of a bunk, was, for the first time in anyone's recorded experience of him, stuck. He did not panic. Vex kept the footage. He inspected the hatch, inspected the ladder cage, inspected the drop, and then lay down on the gantry platform in plain view of the entire freight apron and waited, with the bearing of a passenger whose connecting flight is delayed, for the colony to work it out. The colony nearly didn't. That was the part Vex wrote up at length, because the failure was procedural, and the procedure was hers. The gantry was union plant, Vasek crew only, certified operators, a lockout chain on the controls. The rescue cage that fit the gantry rail was human plant, contract row inventory, bought separately during the boycott years because sharing a rescue cage had been apparently beyond everyone. VASIC operators could move the crane, but had nothing rated to carry the dog down. Human riggers had the cage, but were not certified to touch the crane. For 90 minutes, under a bright sky, with a growing crowd and a child standing at the apron fence with her hands wrapped around the mesh, the two halves of one rescue stood on the same deck consulting separate rulebooks, while above them the dog's head hung over the platform edge, ears up, watching the bureaucracy with interest. It was the foreman who cracked first, Garrett Tull, the VASIC who had run the apron for 9 years and run it the day the container dropped, walked the 40 meters of deck that Union Council had advised him never to cross, and stopped in front of Tomas Abel, who had come on his printed leg. Because every human in the colony came when the dog was in trouble, that was simply understood by then, and the apron went quiet enough to hear the wind tick the stay cables. Your cage, Tull said. My crane. Your sling work. My brake. A beat, and then, in front of his union and her enclave and the wide bright day. I had the brake serviced the wrong quarter 4 years back. It was intolerance on paper. Paper was old. I have wanted to say that for 4 years, and I am saying it to you now on the deck because there is a dog on my gantry and I am out of better moments. Tomas Abel stood very still. Etta Park's voice came across the apron from the fence line, clear as a gate klaxon. He says, sorry, that's the sorry voice. Take it, Mr. Abel. It's been 4 years. Several hundred people did not laugh with difficulty. The sling was set wrong too, Abel said at last. I said it. Both things were true the whole time. That's what I never could stand about it. He looked up at the platform, where the dog watched them both with his chin on his paws. Rig the cage, Garrett. I'll spot the sling. Let's get him down before the government writes another report. The report Vex wrote, entry 22, the longest in the file to that date, recorded the first joint lift on the freight apron in 4 years. A VASIC operator at the controls with a human rigger's hands guiding the sling angles, the rescue cage rising on shared tackle, the dog stepping into it at altitude with the air of royalty boarding a coach, and the dock canteen that evening, serving humans for the first time since Crane Day, because Tull walked Abel in through the front of it with the entire apron crew behind them and dared the room to say anything. The room said nothing. The room moved tables together. The brake and the sling went into the entry too, both of them, because Vex had begun to understand what she was actually documenting, and it was this. The colony's wounds were all double. Every standoff in Suncage Terrace was 2 true things that had never been said in the same room. The dog could not have known that. She wrote that he could not have known that. She then recorded, in the same steady hand, that in 19 weeks, the subject had successively occasioned the same room saying of 2 true things about a fire, 2 true things about a crane, and pending, she wrote, because by then she could see the next one coming the way a seal keeper sees weather, 2 true things about a funeral. But before the funeral came entry 24, and entry 24 was the one Vex almost didn't write, because entry 24 was about the humans, and about the one fracture in Sunkage Terrace that ran straight through a single household. Contract Row's 41 humans were the colony's newest enclave and its most invisible. They had arrived 7 years back on a 10-year terraform support contract, taken the lanes nobody else wanted along the dome's western shoulder, and folded themselves small, the way contract labor learns to on someone else's world. The colony's grand estrangements, the fire, the crane, the breach, mostly predated them or merely bruised them. Their own wound was quieter and worse because it was structural. The contract paid by the shift, the glass line, and the storm wall ran on nights, and so Contract Row was a place where the adults worked while their families slept, and slept while their families lived. 22 of the 41 worked the night rotation. The row had a saying, which Vex collected the way she collected everything that year. We crossed 40 light years to live in the same house and wave. Imra Park had worked nights for 4 years. Vex had known the fact the way a file knows a fact, shift code N2, welder first class, exemplary record, and had never once converted it into its plain meaning until the evening she walked Contract Row on Cordon Review and understood that Etta Park's 200 solitary lunches had a twin, 200 solitary suppers, eaten across the table from a note, in the 2-room unit she shared with a mother she loved and saw awake for roughly 1 hour a day at handover, the way ships see each other at docking. The girl had never once filed a complaint about it. That was Etta all over, the office had learned. She cataloged her own loneliness as weather, unremarkable, nobody's fault, the price of her mother's good name on a hard contract. And Imra had never filed for a day rotation, though her seniority would have carried it, because day rotations on the glass line were half pay, and half pay on Contract Row meant the difference between a future off-world for your daughter and none, and that arithmetic was its own sealed room that mother and daughter had silently agreed never to open in front of each other. The dog opened it the way he opened everything, by lying down in the doorway. It began the week after the schoolyard, when latch circuits of the colony acquired a fixed night station. The threshold of the park unit, dome dark to dome bright. Every night, IMRA's shift code showed NVEX's wardens logged it with their usual scrupulousness before anyone grasped what they were logging. The animal had cross-referenced a shift roster. He was never there on IMRA's rest nights. He was always there, settled across the door like a fallen monument when the girl slept alone. And Contract Row, which noticed everything and said nothing, began leaving its own doors ajar on those nights, a hand's width, a lamp lit. The row quietly re-knitting itself around one child's nights the way rows used to do before everyone learned to fold small. It might have stayed that gentle and that invisible, except that on a blowing gray light night in the dog's 7th month, Etta Park woke at the dark end of the rotation, found the doorway empty, IMRA's rest night. The sentinel was off duty, down on 16 with Orun, and discovered that her mother had not come home. The reason was ordinary, which is to say it was the kind of ordinary that kills. A junction box had flashed on the Stormwall's western run, the standby crew was short, and IMRA Park had taken a double rather than leave the wall's heat sensors dark with weather inbound, and the relay message she'd sent had died in a handover queue, because the night system's notification chain had been built, like everything on Barrow, for crews without children. So a 9-year-old stood alone in a doorway at the dead hour doing the arithmetic of every contract kid. She's late, she's never late. The wall is high, the wind is up, and then she did what the year had taught her the colony did now. She went and got people. She got the dog first, 16 levels down, by the simple expedient of opening the service stair and falling into the dark. The file records that he was at her side before the echo finished, with the lampkeeper's lamp coming fast behind him, because Orun had not waited to dress and never admitted afterward how fast an old sender could take those stairs. She got the Widow Soto, who got the Widow Rill. She got Hada Brim, whose ovens ran before dawn anyway, and Hada Brim got half of Kiln Row, and somewhere on the way across the plaza the procession collected 2 Vasek stevedores coming off shift, a sender clerk opening the records office early, and the entire night watch roster of Vex's own service, who had standing orders by then that wherever the dog was going with that particular gate, wardens went too. What the Stormwall's western run saw, therefore, at the dead hour of a blowing night, was its junction repair interrupted by the arrival of what IMRA Park would describe to the end of her days as the whole town. Lamps strung down the access gallery, bread going hand to hand, a dog the size of the toolbox sled standing at the gallery mouth with her daughter's hand wrapped in his garland fur, and her own chief sealkeeper, summoned from sleep, formally logging the colony's first spontaneous all-faction muster in 11 years. Under incident type, welfare resolved subtype, after a long pause at the form's blank field, family located, family considerably enlarged. The double shift got finished in a third of the time by volunteers who refused to log hours, and the morning after, before Vex had her tea, 3 documents reached her desk in convoy. The first was from the Welders Guild, the human crews and the Vasek wall gangs jointly, a thing without precedent, petitioning to merge the 2 parallel night rosters the colony had been running since Crane Day into one combined rotation, on the grounds that one roster could carry proper relief coverage where 2 thin ones could not. The second was the merged rota itself, already drafted, already signed, in which no parent of a school-age child drew more than 2 consecutive nights. The guild had done the arithmetic, the parks had never let themselves do aloud, spread the cost across 40 shoulders instead of 2, and discovered it came, spread that wide, to almost nothing. The third was a note in a child's hand, delivered by a dog who had learned the route to the security office months ago, which Vex appended to entry 24 against every documentary standard she possessed. Dear Government, Mum is home for supper 3 nights now. I know it was mostly you with the forms. He can't write forms, but he knew which door. Park Vex read it twice, filed it, and recorded beneath it the finding that the note's final sentence was, in the assessing officer's professional judgment, the most economical threat analysis ever entered into a Barrow security file. The whole of the year, the doors, the bench, the bread, the crane, all of it in 4 words. He knew which door, the Widows of Lantern Stair, were entry 26, and Vex never once managed to read it aloud without stopping. Lantern Stair was the oldest residential lane in the colony, 6 doors on a switchback, strung with the hand-blown glass lamps of the founding generation. 2 of those doors faced each other across the landing. Gilda Soto, human, widow of a rigger; Bemaril Offram, widow of a fitter. Their husbands had died in the same minute, in the same seal, in the East Lock breach. 2 of the 9 the wind never gave back, and the 2 women had been close once, the kind of close that shares a stair landing for 20 years, and at the memorial they had broken over 14 words. The colony's monument to the Nine was a plain plate of storm glass by the East Lock approach, and the inscription had been drafted by committee, and the committee had written taken by the storm, and Bema Rill had stood up at the unveiling and said her husband was not taken by any storm, her husband was taken by a seal that someone failed to keep, and she would not lay flowers at a plate that lied to protect an office. And Gilda Soto, whose husband had been crew chief on that seal, had heard it as an accusation aimed across the landing, and perhaps it partly was, and the two doors had shut, and for 11 years the lamps on Lantern Stair were lit by two women who timed their errands never to meet on the switchback. Latch began sleeping on their landing in his 5th month inside the perimeter, not at one door. The file is precise, because Vex walked the stair herself with a measuring line, off-duty, in civilian gray, feeling like a fool and doing it anyway. He slept centered on the landing to within a hand's width, his spine equidistant from the two thresholds, so that neither woman could open her door without stepping over some part of him, and neither could pretend he was the other's problem. He arrived at lamplight, left at dome bright, and was, by every account, the first thing in 11 years that both doors had in common. They fed him on alternating nights inside the first week. Vex established this from the recycler manifests, 2 households' protein orders each rising by precisely 1 large canned ration on interleave days, a synchronization that could only mean the 2 widows were tracking each other's feeding schedule so as never to double feed him, which meant they were communicating, which meant when she checked the lamp fuel logs, that someone was now lighting the whole stair's lamps in 1 pass instead of 2 half passes, and she sat in ops at midnight with feeding schedules and fuel logs spread in front of her, reconstructing a friendship from utility data, and Onik found her there and asked reasonably whether this was security work. No, Vex said. Going to stop? No. The small room the widow Soto had booked at the assembly hall, 2 persons, purpose not stated, was used on a wet day evening in the dog's 6th month. The booking clerk, who was sender and constitutionally incapable of not noticing things, noticed that the 2 persons arrived separately, sat with the table between them for 1 hour, and left together. Noticed also that the dog lay across the room's doorway for the duration, in the corridor, like a draft stopper, like a sworn thing, that the sound through the door for the first half of the hour was 1 voice at a time, formal, taking turns, and that the sound for the last of it was both voices at once, overlapping, and once, the clerk was prepared to certify this, laughter, of the kind that has tears somewhere in its plumbing. What came out of the small room reached Vex as a written petition, 2 signatures, hand-delivered to her office because the monument by the East Lock approach fell, jurisdictionally, under habitat integrity, and therefore under her seal. The petition requested 1 amendment to the inscription, strike taken by the storm, engrave in its place, kept by this colony, and then the 9 names, and then in small letters along the plate's bottom edge, a line the 2 widows had written together at a shared table with a dog against the door. A seal is not a wall. A seal is a promise renewed by hands. Vex read it 4 times. Then she did something she had no precedent for. She carried the petition down into the colony instead of stamping it up in her office. She walked it to Kiln Row and Ferment Row, to the Apron Canteen, to the school, to Contract Row, and she collected in 9 days 2,000 co-signatures from a population that had spent 11 years unable to agree on the color of the sky, and she filed the amendment as approved by acclamation, and she paid for the engraving out of the Integrity Office's discretionary line. Coded, the audit would eventually query it, and she would eventually enjoy answering as seal maintenance. The night the new plate went up, she added entry 26 to file 77, and then sat for a long time with the whole file open across her desk, all of it 26 entries, 5 months, and made herself do what she had been circling for weeks. She pinned the habitat schematic to the board, the full dome, every lane and tier, and she plotted the incidents. A breach map. It was standard method. You plotted intrusions to find the pattern, the route, the weakness being probed. She marked them in order. Lock Row 3, the South Bench. Kiln Row to Ferment Alley, the long diagonal, the schoolyard, the assembly hall, the freight apron, gantry, and canteen. Lantern Stair, the small meeting room, the East Lock Monument. She stood back from the board, and her membranes went flat and stayed flat. The marks made a ring. Not a perfect one. Life never drew perfect, but unmistakable. A circuit of the colony's interior, lane by lane, wound by wound. Every place Sunkage Terrace had walled itself off from itself. Plotted as breaches, the dog's 5 months read as a methodical perimeter assault on every interior wall the colony had, and not one mark, not a single one, on the actual perimeter, the dome, the seals, the storm walls, the only walls a security chief was paid to think about. He goes where the colony is broken, she wrote under the schematic, and lies down on the break. She looked at the sentence. It was not evidence language. She had been trained out of sentences like it, by 20 years of procedure, and she left it in the file anyway, initialed, because it was the finding, and a sealkeeper records the finding, and then, because the next thought arrived with the cold specific weight of a thing that has been waiting, politely for months, she wrote the question that turned File 77 from a ledger of repairs into a live investigation again, the question she would have seen weeks earlier if the bread and the crane and the lamps had not been so bright. Query. Subject demonstrably detects what instruments miss. Gurney subroutines grief the load-bearing cracks in rooms. Subject patrols interior fractures and attends them until mended. Subject originates from outside. Subject entered, every time, through the storm side and has never once attended to the dome itself, unless the dome has no crack to attend, or unless he is saving it. She sat with that until the dome panels cycled to morning. Then she pulled the East Lock Breach Inquiry, Year 14, sealed archive, her own testimony in it, 26 years old and load-bearing, and started reading it the way an enemy would. Storm season was 9 weeks out. The archive took her 4 nights, and on the 4th night the question changed shape. The East Lock Inquiry filled 11 volumes, and Elaine Vex had lived inside it once. 26 years old, a cadet sealkeeper with a perfect memory and a witness summons, and had spent the 11 years since not opening it, which she had called professionalism, and now, reading at midnight with the dome ticking overhead, recognized as something with fewer syllables. The finding was 4 words: negligent calibration. Chief Sealkeeper Dav Orun had signed every calibration log for the East Lock sensor ring in the year before the breach, and the logs showed the ring drifting out of tolerance for 9 weeks before the failure. And Orun had recalibrated it, each time, back to baseline, back to the reference values in the colony's master table. Vex's own testimony, Volume 7, was 19 minutes long and consisted of confirming, document by document, that the seals on those logs were his. They were. Nothing she said had been false. She had checked in the years after many times the way you check a healed bone for weather. What she had never checked, because the inquiry had never asked, because the inquiry had a man and a finding and a colony screaming for both, was the master table. She checked it on the 4th night. She pulled the original commissioning data for the dome's sensor grid, 40 years old, the factory reference curves, and laid them against the master baseline table the colony had been calibrating to ever since, and she ran the comparison. Her predecessor had been stripped of his warrant for not running, and the two did not match, not dramatically. A fraction of a degree of harmonic tolerance here, a pressure response constant rounded there, and a correction logged in year 6, 8 years before the breach, system-wide, applied to the master table by an off-world maintenance contractor during a routine grid update, documented in a footnote that referenced an appendix that the colony's copy of the manual did not contain. The grid had been retuned once, decades ago, by parties unknown for reasons unrecoverable, and every calibration since, Orun's, and then for 11 years, her own, had faithfully, precisely, immaculately returned the colony's sensors to the wrong baseline. The drift Orun kept correcting had been the East Lock ring trying to tell the truth. Vex sat with the 2 curves glowing on her desk until her hands were steady enough to be a chief's hands again. The arithmetic of it was almost gentle. The error was small, the dome was overbuilt, and for 40 years small times overbuilt had equaled survivable. It had taken the worst squall in honey history, hitting the one lock where the error stacked against the load path, to turn a rounding choice into 9 names on storm glass. And then the colony had pinned the physics on a man, and the man had signed for it the way SEALs signed for weather, and the sensors had gone on being calibrated to the lie, in her hand now instead of his. 11 years, every quarter, her own seal on every log. The system says seal integrity 100%, Onik had said, the first morning, while a dog walked through 3 shut doors. The system had been saying it for 40 years. She did not take it to the council. She took it, and she would be asked later, in the bright aftermath, why, and would answer honestly, because I owed it downward, not upward, to the service tiers, on foot, alone, off the duty log, following the one resident of Suncage Terrace who had never once appeared in it. She had known for weeks where Latch went when he left the upper colony, because she had finally done what no sensor could and simply walked behind him. He permitted it the way he permitted weather. Down the freight stair, through a maintenance gallery the schematics called crawl space, and the dog's traffic had worn into a road, past 3 junctions where the lighting conduits had been respliced by hand, neat, old-fashioned, jacketed splices, a craftsman's work, keeping lit a level the colony had written off, to a door at the end of a warm corridor that smelled of solder and bread. The bread smell was new this season. Kiln row bread. Someone was carrying loaves down 16 levels. The door had a lamp above it, hand-blown glass, founding generation work, lit. She knocked the way you knock when you are not there with a warrant. The man who opened it had been her chief once. Deathworld was old now, and the way Sender got old, membranes gone pale, frame gone fine. But the eyes that took in her uniform were the eyes that had taught her to read a pressure curve before she could legally hold a sidearm. And the voice was the same voice, dry as a service tier. "Kata," he said, "you've made rank. Either the dog finally led you down here, or the colony's learned to read its own commissioning data. I confess I've stopped betting on the second." Behind him, the room, a workbench rivered with lamp parts, a wall of hand-kept journals, 40 years of them, a cot, and a floor space by the heat exchange exactly the size of a sleeping Great Dane, currently occupied by a sleeping Great Dane, who opened one eye at Vex, established that she was hers, and closed it. "He's been yours," Vex said. "All this time, 11 years. He's been nobody's, which you know, because you've read his registration." Oren stood aside to let her in, which was its own sentence, 11 years long. "He came off a livestock hauler as a pup, the year after they put me down here, off manifest. Somebody's unpaid cargo nobody claimed. He was the size of a boot and the temperament of a bulkhead, and I fed him because feeding something was." He stopped and chose the engineer's word over the other one, stabilizing. "He stayed until he was grown, and then he started going up. I didn't send him. You can't send him. He goes where it's broken," Vex said. "I know, I mapped it. I know you mapped it." A paper-dry rustle that was Sender laughter. "Who do you think taught him stairs?" Then he looked at her, at the satchel under her arm with 11 volumes worth of Midnight in it, and the lightness went out of him the way it goes out of a man who has rehearsed a conversation for a decade and never once expected to hold it. "Say the thing you climbed down 16 levels to say, Elaine." She laid the two curves on his workbench. Factory reference. Master baseline. Year 6 footnote. The space between them, 8 years wide, 9 names deep. He read it the way the old read the names of classmates. He did not say "I told the inquiry," although he had volume 9, page after page of a man insisting the drift was real and the baseline was wrong, sounding exactly like negligence dressed as theory, because he could not produce a 40-year-old appendix the colony had never possessed. He said, finally, quietly, "It will have kept stacking. The correction compounds at every quarterly, 11 more years of your immaculate work, plus mine." He pulled a journal from the wall, unerring, one of 40. "I never stopped logging it. Couldn't reach the grid from down here, so I logged what a man can log. Door cycle times, draft patterns, the harmonic note the South Arc makes under load. The dome sings. Did you know that? Every storm it sings, and the pitch has been climbing a quarter tone a year for as long as I've had nothing better to do than listen." He set the journal in her hands. "Your grid will read green until the minute it doesn't, because you've tuned it to call this normal. But the South Gallery arc is carrying a fatigue load your sensors are calibrated not to see, and the dog." He glanced at the gray heap by the heat exchange, and his voice did the thing hers did around entry 26. "The dog won't lie. Under the South Gallery, Chief. Hasn't for 2 seasons. He'll lie centered on any threshold in this colony except that one. I'd call that the only honest sensor reading in Sunkage Terrace." Vex stood in a lamp mender's workshop 16 levels under her own office, holding 40 years of hand-kept truth, and assembled the sentence that had been building in her since the first morning, since 11 seconds, since the plaza evaporated around a walking shadow and one child failed to run. "I need you to come up," she said. "No, Dav. The colony took my warrant, my name, and my wife's good opinion of her last years, and the colony can rot." Oren said, without heat, the way a man states a calibration constant. "I keep their lamps lit because lamps aren't the colony, lamps are lamps. I feed their dog because the dog isn't the colony either. The dog is whatever the opposite of a colony is, something that goes toward the broken thing." He took the journal gently back out of her hands and put it in her satchel himself, which was its own second sentence. "Take the data, retune your grid, save the dome, cadet. You were always going to be the one who did. But you'll do it without making me stand in front of them again." She went up 16 levels with the journals, and storm season came down to 7 weeks, and that might have been the whole of it. Quiet retuning, a corrected baseline, a vindication filed where the colony files things it cannot face, if the off-world menagerie broker had not arrived on the same supply run as the storm forecast. The broker's name was Cuvier Halst. He was licensed out of a registry no one could pronounce, and he had heard freight crews talk. The story of the Deathworld stray that opened a colony had traveled 4 systems by then, that Sunkage Terrace possessed a large, intact, socialized Earth canon of exceptional documented intelligence, unowned in any defensible legal sense, and he had arrived with a hold full of humane certified containment and a number with 5 zeros in it. He presented to the council the way brokers present, not buying an animal, never that, relocating an unmanaged predator, compensating the colony for nuisance and risk, providing the creature a curated habitat. He had clean documents and a cleaner voice, and he had timed his arrival with a professional's instinct to the 7-day legal window in which the colony's standing subcommittee on the animal question was obliged to hear disposition motions. And the colony, Vex, made herself record this too, because the file was nothing if it was not honest. The colony did not laugh him out of the dome. 11 years of fear had habits. The plaza still emptied, even now, even fondly, even with children sorting themselves by who had touched the torn ear. The older residents still watched the dog with their hands, remembering door frames. And a 50 number, to a colony that had been buying off-world flour for 6 years out of spite, was a number. The motion to approve relocation gathered co-sponsors the way wet grain gathers heat. The subcommittee set a hearing for 5 days. The colony, which could now hold assemblies, prepared to hold the worst one of its life. They held it in the main hall, and everyone came. That was the fact Vex kept returning to. After everyone came, 9 species, both market rows, the apron crews, contract row to the last adult, the school released early, the widows of Lantern Stare, side by side in the second row, with a thermos between them. 11 years ago, the colony could not fill a hall for its own dead. Now it filled one wall to wall for a dog, and it filled it split clean down the middle. Relocation motion against residency petition, the first colony-wide argument in living memory that everyone had agreed to have in the same room. Halse presented first, and he was good. Containment footage of contented animals, actuarial tables of candid risk. The phrase "no fault" attaches to the creature deployed twice. The number displayed discreetly in a font that knew exactly what it was doing. Then the motion's floor manager, a sender actuary, sincere, frightened, not a villain. Vex was past needing villains by then, called as supporting evidence for the public reading of the Security Service's complete incident documentation on the subject animal. He called for File 77. He had every right. It was a disposition hearing. The file was the official record. The chief sealkeeper was sworn to produce it. The hall went quiet the way the plaza had once gone quiet, and Onik, beside her at the service table, made a sound low in his chest because he knew what was in the file. He had typed half of it, and he knew what a hostile floor manager could do with it. 91 entries of doors defeated, barriers bypassed, sedation shrugged off, property relocated, a plaza emptied in 11 seconds. Read cold, in evidence voice, File 77 was the case for the crate, signed quarterly by the colony's own threat assessor. Vex stood. She carried the file to the lectern flat against her chest the way she had carried it for months. She looked out at her colony, every fracture of it seated shoulder to shoulder in one room because a stray had spent a year arranging exactly this, and she opened the file to Entry 1, and she read it the way its author had finally learned to. Entry 1, she read. Subject defeated Lock Row 3 without damage and crossed a hostile crowd of 400 without contact in order to sit beside the one resident of this colony who was alone. The floor manager started to object. The entry as written said designation pending and emptied plaza and threat assessment opened. She could see his copy in his hands, see him finding the discrepancy. And Vex looked up from the lectern and said, "Council will find I am reading the file's findings, not its formatting. I wrote it. I am the only being alive qualified to read it correctly, and the hall has called for it, and the hall will have all of it." She turned the page. The hall let her. Halls, she had learned this year, will let a person do almost anything if a dog has prepared the room. Entry 12. Subject identified the oldest commercial feud in the colony and resolved it in one afternoon using a tablecloth. Costs incurred, none. Bread supply, restored. Entry 17. Subject dismantled an 11-year-old segregation system maintained by 400 children and their parents. Method. Sat down in it. Entry 19. First, colony-wide Guardians Assembly in 11 years convened because of the subject. First 9-faction co-signed petition in colony history filed because of the subject. Entry 22. Subject occasioned the end of the freight apron division, the reopening of the dock canteen, and the first joint lift in 4 years, by getting stuck on purpose or by accident. The assessing officer has reviewed the footage 200 times and declines to rule out either. Entry 26. She stopped. The hall was silent in a way no procedure could have produced. In the second row, the Widow Rill's hand found the Widow Soto's wrist. Entry 26 is engraved on storm glass by the East Lock approach, and the hall may read it on the way home, where it says what this office now believes the subject has been doing in Sunkage Terrace since the morning he arrived. She closed the file on her own thumb and looked at the broker's actuarial tables still glowing on the display, candid risk in 9 columns. This is the Security Service's complete assessment. The animal before this hearing is the single most effective piece of civic infrastructure this colony possesses. He has reopened 1 market diagonal, 1 canteen, 1 school commons, 2 front doors on Lantern Stair, and 1 assembly hall, which he filled, tonight, with every faction we have, the first full house in colony memory, achieved by the simple method of being worth arguing about. My office has spent 11 years maintaining the seals of a habitat that was sealed in, 80 places on the inside. He found all 80. I have the map. It is in evidence. She let that sit one breath. The motion proposes to sell him. The service's recommendation is recorded as follows. A colony that has just learned to sit in one room again should think very carefully before it. Crates the reason and ships it to a zoo. She sat down. The hall did not erupt. Sunkage Terrace had never once erupted. It did something Vex found she preferred. 2,000 people began, all at once in 9 languages, to argue with their neighbors, with their actual neighbors, elbow to elbow, across every old line at full volume, and the chair gavelled for order and did not entirely want it, and the floor manager was rereading entry 12 with his membranes flat, and Cuvier Hall studied the room with the expression of a man watching 5 zeros walk away from him, and that was the moment the storm klaxon went off. Not the drill tone. The real one, the long triple seal stations, all wardens, a sound half the hall was too young to have heard outside training, and the other half had heard exactly once, 11 years ago, on the day the wind took 9 people, and Vex was at the service table with the file still in her hand when every duty screen in the hall lit at once with the forecast revision. The squall line that the morning charts had tracked to pass south of Barrow's Terminator had bred a second cell, and the second cell had turned, and Sunkage Terrace had gone from 7 weeks of storm season to 19 hours of storm watch between one gavel and the next. The hearing did not adjourn so much as transform. Vex took the lectern back without asking, and the chair handed it over without objecting, because constitutional niceties die early in storm watch, and the chief sealkeeper read the colony at stations like a roll call. Storm shutter crews, SEAL teams, dome wardens, freight apron lockdown, school to the deep shelter galleries at first siren. The colony had run this drill 100 times in 11 years. It had never once run it as one room. She watched faction leaders who had learned each other's names this year sorting their crews into mixed teams, by trade instead of species, riggers with riggers, kiln hands with anyone who could carry, and she thought, with the cold clarity that storms always brought her. A year ago, this would have been 6 separate preparations, 6 tool cribs, 2 sign-out sheets, and a plaza everyone crossed around the edges. Then she went to find the dog, because there was one reading she trusted now above every instrument she owned, and she needed it before the wind arrived. She found him where Oren's journal said she would not. Latch stood in the south gallery, the long glazed arcade along the dome's southern arc, the colony's favorite promenade, storm-rated, sensor-monitored, every panel of it reading green, and he was not lying down. He stood square in the center of the gallery's deck with his head low and his ears flat, and he was trembling. 103 kilograms of animal that had regarded sedation darts as light rain, that had slept through plaza panics and council votes, that had in 14 months of documentation never once shown the colony a single signal of fear, stood in the prettiest corridor in Sunkage Terrace shaking like a struck wire. The grid said the South Arc was green. Oren's 40 journal said the South Arc was singing a quarter tone higher every year. The dog said the South Arc was the one place in the colony he would not put his body on the floor. Onik, Vex said into the duty channel, very evenly, because a chief who shouted taught her whole watch to shout, "Pull the shelter assignments. Who's posted to the South Gallery for the blow?" The answer took 4 seconds, and it was the answer she already knew, because the South Gallery was rated and reinforced and recently inspected, and Sunkage Terrace did what its instruments told it. Shelter Station 4 Chief, South Gallery, and the 2 side bays. Assigned occupancy for the storm, a rustle of lists 640. Contract row, lantern stair, kiln row families, it's their designated section. Chief, it's the strongest arc on the chart, the chart. The chart was calibrated to the year 6 baseline. The strongest arc on the chart was the arc her sensors were tuned not to see dying, and in 19 hours, 640 residents, the widows, the bakers, Imra Park on her night shift rotation, Etta, were going to carry their bedrolls into it and listen to the wind through panels that read 100%. Vex stood in the gallery's bright cold daylight between the green board and the gray dog and met the moment her whole career had been walking toward at an unhurried diagonal. Procedure said, the grid is green, the rating holds. Reassign nothing on the testimony of an animal. Procedure had said negligent calibration, Chief Sealkeeper. Procedure had been calibrated 40 years ago by parties unknown to call the drift normal, and every immaculate quarterly since had been a seal renewing a lie, and the only instruments in Sunkage Terrace that had ever read the truth were a disgraced old man's ear, a hand-kept journal, and a stray dog who would lie down on every broken thing in the colony except this one. Reassign Shelter Station 4, she said. Empty the South Gallery and both side bays for the duration. Redistribute to the plaza vaults and the freight apron deep bays. Chief, the occupancy math, the vaults take 400 overrated comfort Comfort isn't a seal rating. Do it. And get me the manual harmonics rig from Deep Stores, the old one, the pre-grid one. If it's been cannibalized, I want it rebuilt by Windrise. She looked at the trembling dog, and the dog looked at her. And for the first time in 14 months of mutual professional surveillance, something passed between the colony's two threat assessors that Vex declined to log in any file. And Onik, send a runner down to the lamp mender on Service 16. Tell him his cadet is pulling the South Arc out of the load path on the word of his dog, and she needs the man who can hear the dome sing to tell her where to brace it. There was a silence on the channel with a grin in it. And if he says no, he won't, Vex said. He's been waiting 11 years for somebody to ask. The Stormwall crews worked through the night under dome panels burning full bright, and Suncage Terrace turned out to a body. That was the part no drill had ever produced and no order of hers could have. The colony came because the colony this year was a thing that came. Vassic crane crews swung brace girders down the South Arc while human riggers, Tomas Abel at the sling directing, set them home. Kiln Row's ovens ran all night, and the bread went down both rows and across the apron. No manifest, no tally. The school's older children ran message relay when the Stormwatch protocols took the comm spectrum. Grelsoon's growers webbed the gallery glazing with storm mesh from their own field stores. And down the center of all of it walked Dav Oren. Up from Service 16 for the first time in 11 years, grid-blind and needing nothing but his ear and his cane, laying his pale hand flat against the dome ribs one by one, listening, while the colony that had buried him alive parted around him with a silence that was half shame and half awe, and a black Great Dane paced at his hip like a warrant restored. Here, Orun said, at the gallery's western third, palm on the rib, and hear it? Quarter tone sharp, both of them, and the beat frequency between, that's the fatigue note. Brace these two and the arc stops asking the glazing to carry shear it was never rated for. He glanced at Vex, and the old dryness came up through him like a lamp warming. Your grid will say the braces are unnecessary. Log my objection. I'll log it as a calibration, Vex said. The wind arrived at 0530 station dark, and it arrived the way Barrow's worst always had. Not as a sound, but as a pressure in the bones, a flat hand laid against the whole world, and then the first glass squall hit the dome and the dome sang. The colony, packed into the plaza vaults in the deep bays, 640 bedrolls redistributed, 400 overrated comfort, nobody complaining where Vex could hear, which she suspected was a colony-wide conspiracy of politeness, went quiet and listened to their world be, hit by their planet. Latch did not shelter. Vex had expected nothing else and posted herself accordingly. The dog patrolled, there was no other word. He walked the inhabited galleries in a steady circuit, threading between bedrolls, and where he passed, the children settled and the adults breathed slower, 600 strangers' shoulders coming down a centimeter at a time, and she finally understood at full scale what the South Bench had been teaching the colony for 14 months. The animal's calm went outward. It was infrastructure. It was a utility like light. For 9 hours the dome held the way overbuilt things hold, and the new braces took the South Arc's load, and the manual harmonics rig, rebuilt by Windrise, Orun's thumb on its tuning, read the rib frequencies steady. Vex began carefully, professionally, to believe they had caught it in time. Then, in the storm's 11th hour, Latch stopped mid-circuit in the plaza vault, lifted his head toward the southeast service trunk, a corridor of conduit and recycler plant, unglazed, uninhabited, so structurally boring that it appeared on the threat schematic as a gray line, and did the thing that 14 months of File 77 said he never did. He made a sound. The colony had a whole folklore by then about the dog's silence. He doesn't bark. The children explained to every newcomer, he's never once, it's his thing. And what came out of him now was not a bark. It started below hearing, a pressure the vault felt in its chest before its ears, and rose through the packed shelter like a tide through gravel. A howl, single, sustained, enormous, the sound of something very old being done by something very large, and every conversation in the vault died at once, and in the ringing silence afterward the dog was already moving, not at his eternal, unhurried walk, but low and fast and absolutely certain, straight at the southeast trunk, and Elaine Vex, chief sealkeeper of Sunkage Terrace, looked at her green board one last time, and threw it away, and ran after the only sensor that had never lied to her. The southeast trunk was 200 meters of conduit gallery between the plaza vaults and the atmospheric recycler plant, and the reason it appeared on the threat schematic as a gray line was that there was nothing in it to fail. No glazing, no occupancy, no exterior face except one. Halfway down its length, behind a maintenance screen that had not been opened since before Vex held a warrant, the trunk's original construction included a service airlock from the colony's outpost days, decommissioned, plated over, patch-welded shut in year 14 by repair crews working triple shifts in the weeks after the East Lock breach, when the colony had sealed every legacy penetration it could find and grieved too hard to document half of them. A patch weld, like a calibration, is a promise renewed by hands. Nobody's hands had renewed this one in 11 years, because the grid said the trunk was green, and the grid said the trunk was green because the trunk's sensor loop had been baselined in year 6, before the weld existed, and had been faithfully averaging the weld's slow whisper into normal for over a decade. Glass squalls do not blow steadily. They breathe, pressure waves stacking and releasing as the storm cells wheel, and for 11 hours the storm had been breathing against a plate of patch weld the size of a hatch cover, flexing it on its fatigue line a few microns at a time, and the whisper had become a leak, and the leak, in the storm's 11th hour, had begun to sing. Too high for sender membranes, too faint for Vasek bone hearing. Outside every calibrated band on the grid, inside the band, apparently, of an Earth canid who had spent his whole life listening to this dome the way other creatures listen for prey. When Vex came through the trunk hatch with 2 SEAL teams behind her, the dog was standing at the maintenance screen with his nose an inch from its lower seam, rigid, and the sound was finally in her own range, too. A thin, continuous shriek, the voice of pressure finding a path, the worst sound a SEAL keeper's trade owns. She put her palm flat against the screen and felt it tremble like the dog had trembled. And her board, she had carried the portable out of pure habit, showed her in serene green letters, trunks, nominal, manual isolation, she said. And her voice on the channel was the flattest it had ever been, which everyone who served under her knew to read as the needle wrapped around its pin. Both trunk bulkheads hand cranks now. The actuators won't fire. The system thinks the trunk is already sealed. It has always thought everything is already sealed. We are going to teach it otherwise with a bar in our backs. Team 2, get the recycler plant on its own air, and somebody pull that screen. The screen came off and the colony's hidden wounds stood in the work lights. The year 14 weld, 1.5 meters of hasty triple shift bead laid by grieving hands, sweating threads of storm dust at 3 points along its lower line, the whole plate bowing in microns to the rhythm of the wind. Behind it, 200 millimeters of decommissioned airlock and then barrow, breathing. The next 40 minutes went into File 77 as Entry 88, and into colony memory as the long crank, and Vex's official account is, as always, exact. The southeast trunk was isolated by manual bulkhead closure, the recycler plant transferred to reserve air, the failing weld shored with brace plate, and the inner patch renewed under storm conditions by volunteer crews working in relayed shifts. No casualties, no resident exposure. What the account does not carry, what no account of hers had ever needed to carry before this year, and what she wrote in anyway, initialed, because the file had long since become the truest thing in the colony, is who the volunteer crews were. The bulkhead cranks were built for Vasek shoulders, gummed by 11 greenlit years, and the western crank froze at half travel with the leaks no climbing. It moved again because Gerard Tull and Tomas Abel braced the same bar. Crane foreman and the rigger his brake had maimed. 4 years of silence between them and both, their weights on one steel lever, and when it gave for both of them at once. The brace plates came down 16 levels from deep stores on the shoulders of kiln row and ferment row in alternating relay, Hadabrim directing the stack like a woman loading her own oven. The renewed weld was laid by the colony's 2 best surviving pressure welders, who had not worked a joint together since year 14 because one of them was Imra Park, night shift, contract row, and the other was an Offram named Essek Rill, the widow Rill's eldest, and the last bead they had laid together was on their father's memorial, sections of the East Lock. They worked in 2-minute reliefs, visor to visor, while Dava Orun stood behind them with his hand flat on the trunk rib, calling the fatigue notes retreat quarter tone by quarter tone like a man talking a fever down, his restored colony arrayed down the corridor in a bucket chain of brace bolts and breathing masks and tea. And at the trunk hatch, facing the wrong way, facing inward, toward the colony, toward the vaults, sat the dog. He had led them to the wound and then he had turned around, and Vex understood it within the first minute, because 400 sheltering residents had heard the howl and the klaxons, and the colony's children knew exactly where Latch was, and what stood between 600 curious, frightened, devoted people and an active breach operation was 103 kilograms of sentinel sitting in the hatchway, outward-facing, immovable, calm as carved stone, and nobody crossed him, not the terrified, not the brave, not the helpful. The vault crowds pressed to the trunk's outer windows and watched their neighbors save them, held at a door by a doorkeeper, and Etta Park stood at the front of them all, with both hands and her forehead against the glass, and the recording shows that for the whole of the long crank the dog's eyes never left her, which is to say he was doing the same work twice. The weld took. The note died. The wind, with no sense of theater, blew for 9 more hours and then wandered off across Barrow the way storms do, undefeated merely elsewhere, and at a 2-1 station dark the dome stopped singing, and the colony of Suncage Terrace stood up out of its shelters, 400 overrated comfort, alive to a soul. The grid had read green from the first minute to the last. What Vex did with that fact, in the weeks after the storm, she did with the colony watching, because she had learned the lesson of the year, and the lesson of the year was that nothing in Suncage Terrace healed in a sealed room. The Year 6 baseline error, the factory curves, Oren's 40 journals, the corrected mathematics of the Eastlock breach. All of it was read into the open record at a full assembly, the actuary subcommittee checking every figure, the hall as full for the colony's oldest wound as it had been for the dog. It took 4 hours. Nobody left. The finding, adopted by acclamation and engraved, the colony had developed a taste for engraving things onto a second plate of storm, glass beside the first at the Eastlock approach, ran. The seal did not fail its keepers. The keepers were taught a false note and kept it faithfully. Deathworld was the first to hear the difference. This colony took 11 years to listen. They offered him his warrant back at the same assembly. Vex tendered it herself in front of everyone, the original, retrieved from archive, his name unstruck, and the old sender looked at it for a long moment, and then at the hall, and declined it in a voice that carried to the back wall without trying. Keep your warrant. The colony has a seal keeper, and she reads commissioning data, which is more than my generation managed. The driest rustle. I will accept a different post, if the assembly insists on giving me one. Someone has been keeping the lamps on the lower tiers lit for 11 years, and I notice the position has never appeared on an org chart. Make it real. Lampkeeper, service tier 16 and all stairs. I have, he said, and laid his hand on the gray head that had not left his hip all evening. An assistant who knows the route. The assembly made it real. It was, the clerk confirmed, the first new post created in Suncage Terrace since the breach year, and the first ever ratified unanimously. Cuvier Holst and his hold full of humane containment had lifted off 3 days after the storm, empty. He was, in the end, a professional. He had stood in the plaza the morning after the long crank, watching the colony queue at the kiln rails, watching a Vassic crane foreman carry tea to a human rigger's table, watching 2 widows walk the market diagonal arm in arm, watching a Deathworld stray asleep in the bright fall of dome light with 3 children using him openly as furniture and a 4th, the small human one, asleep against his shoulder, while the entire adult population conducted its commerce around them at a careful, fond, unconscious radius. And Holst had run whatever arithmetic brokers run and concluded that he was looking at the one animal in the spiral arm with no extractable value whatsoever, because its value was the room. You cannot crate a room. For what it is worth, Chief, he said to Vex at the gate, with the 50 number folded away forever, I have cataloged rare fauna on 60 worlds. I have never before had to classify one as load-bearing. The residency vote, when the subcommittee finally held it, was a formality with 2,000 witnesses. The motion as drafted granted the animal-designated latch permanent resident status under the household of Park. The motion as amended from the floor by Hatta Brim, seconded by Garrett Tull, the kind of craw-faction sponsorship that had been impossible 16 months earlier and now happened so routinely the clerk had stopped noting it, granted him something the colony's law had never contained and had to build on the spot. Resident of the whole, household of all, the first and only being in Suncage Terrace registered not to an address but to the habitat itself. The clause behind the clause, drafted by Vex's own office, was practical. His gate profile, the slow, heavy, steady center line walk that had defeated lock row 3 on the first morning, was written into the door grid as a standing credential. Every door in the colony now opened for latch by law, which the children considered only fair, since every door in the colony had been doing it anyway by physics. She closed file 77 on a bright 4th-day morning, 11 months after she had opened it, at the small table outside the arbitration hall that had become her preferred office, with the plaza at full roar in front of her. Entry 91, the last, took her the longest of any of them, and in the end it was 4 lines, because she had been trained out of sentences by 20 years of procedure and back into them by 1 dog. She did not write it straight off. A closing entry, by her own office's standard, required a full review of the file it closed, and so on that bright 4th-day morning, Elaine Vex did what she had done all her life with seals, and never once, before this year, with anything alive. She went back to the beginning and checked every joint. The early entries read like another officer's work, which in a sense they were. Entries 13 through 15 were the capture attempts, undertaken in the file's 2nd month under council pressure she had bent, but could not wholly refuse, and they had aged into pure comedy, though her language at the time had been bulletproof. Entry 13, the baited transport crate, rated for megafauna, placed in the service stair junction with a haunch of vat protein inside. The dog had, the file's verb, audited it. He had walked around the crate twice, looked with open disappointment at the warden concealed behind the recycler stack, and then lain down on top of the crate, on its roof, in the manner of a paperweight, until the shift changed and everyone agreed to pretend the afternoon had not happened. He was, the entry concluded, not unwilling to be contained. He was declining to insult anyone by acknowledging the attempt. Entry 14, the net rig, had ended before deployment when the dog presented himself at the rigging point during setup and sat on the folded net. Entry 15 consisted, in its entirety, of one sentence in Onyx hand, filed while Vex was off shift, which she had lacked the heart to strike. Chief, he found the dart cabinet, moved it we don't know where, request guidance, also request we stop. Guidance had been issued. They had stopped. The council had been managed with a phrase she was still proud of. Containment is achieved. The subject is contained by the colony perimeter, which he maintains better than we do. And the file moved on, and rereading it now she could follow her own conversion in the drying ink. Somewhere around entry 30 she had stopped writing subject as the first word of every paragraph. Somewhere around entry 40 she had started recording what the colony did next, as if the dog were the weather, and the weather report had quietly become a census of everything growing. Entry 33 was the choir. The exploratory booking from the Guardians' Assembly had produced 11 residents of 6 species in a room with a tuning pipe and a decade of rust, and the file noted, with a precision Vex chose to stand behind forever, that the colony's mixed choir had reformed on a wet day evening with subject lying against the room's base wall, and that he attended every rehearsal thereafter, and that attendance grew in his wake. First the children who followed him everywhere, then the parents who followed the children, until the corps master, a duelet with kiln-scared hands and perfect pitch, capped membership at 60 and started a waiting list, the colony's first waiting list for anything that was not a ration. The file did not record that the choir's first public piece, sung at the East Lock approach on the anniversary of the breach, had been written that year by the widow Rill and the widow Soto together, words by the one, melody by the other. It did not need to. The whole colony had been there. The recording existed. Vex had watched the dog sit through it at the foot of the new storm glass plate, still as the names themselves, and had gone home and written only entry 36. The colony sang, subject present, no anomalies, which was, she maintained, the most accurate report of her career. Entry 41 was Etta's 10th birthday, logged because it constituted, technically, an unpermitted public assembly. The girl who had eaten alone on the south bench for 200 market mornings had stood in the middle of a plaza. Wide party she had not organized. Kiln row had baked, ferment row had brewed something the file described as legal upon review. The school had simply arrived. Looking around herself with an expression Vex had needed a long moment to identify, because the file's early photographs of the child contained nothing to compare it to. It was the look of a person counting and failing to finish. Latch had sat beside her all afternoon, outward-facing, on duty, and when the dome panels cycled to amber, the girl had climbed onto the fountain rim and made a speech, 6 sentences long, which the plaza had received in total silence and which the file preserved verbatim because the assessing officer had been standing close and writing fast and unashamed. When we moved here, I used to pretend the bench was a ship and I was going somewhere else. I'm not pretending that anymore, so you can all stop worrying. Mum, this means you. He picked me first, but he was never just mine. I think I was the door he could reach. You're all in now. Nobody gets to leave. Nobody gets to leave. The colony had repeated to itself all that winter in 9 languages, laughing, as the plaza filled and the kiln queues lengthened and the apron crews took their tea in one shift now, at one counter. It had the shape of a threat and the function of a vow, and it was, Vex thought, the most concise minutes of any assembly Sunkage Terrace had ever held. Entry 47 was the drill, and rereading it now, on the far side of the storm, Vex's hand stilled on the page because entry 47 was the one where the colony had rehearsed its own survival without knowing it. The autumn storm drill was a statutory formality she had run 11 times to 11 identical results. 6 enclaves filing to 6 separate shelter sections by 6 separate routes, on time in silence past each other. That 12th autumn, for reasons the file traced through the merged night rota, the abolished seating chart, and the reopened canteen, the drill broke her stopwatch. Kiln row families turned up at the plaza vaults, already mixed with ferment rows because their children refused to be sorted. The apron crews ran the freight bays as one team with one tool crib and beat their standing time by 9 minutes. And when a duelet grandmother went missing from the count, the search that found her, asleep, unharmed, in a reading alcove, took 90 seconds, because 40 residents of 5 species knew her habits well enough to name the alcove, where 11 years of drills had produced neighbors who could not have named her face. Vex had logged the times, and then logged the finding under them, not knowing she was writing the climax's rehearsal notes. A shelter plan is only as fast as its strangers. This colony no longer has any. And beneath that, because the dog had spent the entire drill lying in the exact geometric center of the plaza vault with children stacked against him, like sandbags, she had added the addendum her office would reread the night the real wind came. Subject treats the drill as the one assembly not worth supervising. Assessing officer concurs with his risk model and is professionally unsettled by it. Entry 55, midwinter, was the night the heating loop on Lantern Stair failed in a cold snap, and the file recorded the response time of the repair crew, 11 minutes, a colony record, and the fact that when the crew arrived they found the two widows' doors both open, both households consolidated around one hearth, and the dog stretched across the threshold gap like a draft stopper, holding the heat of two homes in one room with his own body, and the senior fitter had radioed back to Ops the immortal status line. Heat loss contained by resident, request no further action. He looks comfortable. Entry 60 was Oron's, the only entry in the file not in Vex's or Onyx's hand. She had begun by then carrying the file down to service 16 on her off shifts. For consultation, she logged, which was true, and for the bread, which she did not log, and for the company, which needed no logging because the dog had made the route a road and the road went both ways now. Half the upper colony had business on the lower tiers these days, and the lower tiers had lamps, and the lamps had a keeper, and the keeper had visitors. On one such evening, Davarun had taken the file from her, read it end to end in silence, and added, in the spidery commissioning standard script of 40 years ago, one line under her map of incidents, beside her sentence about the dog lying down on broken things. Addendum, Davarun Consulting, note that he lay down on me first. Some repairs take 11 years to test under load. This one held. She had not been able to reply for a while the evening he wrote that. The dog had put his chin on her knee, which the file did not record, and which she would remember with perfect calibration for the rest of her life. Entry 66 was the one the off-world auditors would someday struggle with, because Entry 66 documented the moment the dog became a procedure. It had grown out of the widow's hour in the small room, the way everything that year grew out of something. Residents had noticed that the hardest conversations in Sunkage Terrace kept happening behind, doors that latch happened to be lying against, and the colony being the colony, somebody eventually filed the observation as a request. The booking clerk's ledger for the small room acquired, in its margins, a new and entirely unofficial column, and the column filled. A grower and her estranged brother, 12 years silent over an inheritance of 40 square meters of soil rights, booked the room and the margin. Two apron gang bosses with a grievance older than either could accurately retell. A teacher and a parent, a pair of clerks. The procedure, as codified by nobody and obeyed by everyone, was this. You booked the small room, two persons, purpose not stated. You told the clerk's margin. And if your quarrel was real, this was the part the colony said in a lowered voice, half joke and all belief, he came. Nobody summoned him. Nobody had ever summoned him anywhere. But the margin filled, and the dog's evening circuit bent to it with the reliability of a tide chart, and door after door after door, the small room did its work with a gray doorstop holding the corridor until the clerk reported to the subcommittee, deadpan, that the colony's backlog of unspoken grievances was running low and the room might soon be reduced to hosting card games. Vex had investigated, naturally. She had cross-checked the margin against the circuit logs for a month, looking for the mechanism, scent, schedule, some signal in how the bookings were made, and had found nothing her instruments could hold, and had written up the failure in the only language left, mechanism unestablished. The subject cannot read a ledger. The assessing officer's best remaining hypothesis is that he reads the colony directly and that the ledger is simply where the colony's weight shifts first. Recommend no further investigation. Some calibrations are not improved by being understood. Onyx had read that entry over her shoulder, been quiet a moment, and then said the thing that went into the file's margin in his hand, the office's whole year in one line, Chief, we used to map where he'd been. Now we map where he'll be needed. When did those become the same map she had not answered? The answer was entry 1. And then the entries climbed through the hearing, the storm, the long crank, the second plate of storm glass, the vote. And the file came up to date, and there was nothing left between Elaine Vex and entry 91 except the plaza in front of her, at full roar on festival morning. Because that was the last thing the colony had done, and she had saved it for the file's final page. They had reopened the festival. It had taken the subcommittee, the Animal Questions Subcommittee, which had long since stopped discussing the animal and become, by general consent and without anyone amending its charter, the committee on everything the colony had stopped doing and might start again, 4 months to plan, mostly because every faction kept volunteering for more of it. The festival of the founding suspended 12 years the reason the Plaza Iris existed, a market day of all rows. A procession of lamps from the lowest tier to the dome's height, the choir at the fountain, the doors of the colony stood open from bright to amber. All the doors. That was the festival's oldest rule, older than the breach, older than the fear. On founding day, Sunkage Terrace opened everything inward. Every shop, every hall, every home with a willing threshold. Because the founders had crossed the void, packed in sealed cans, and had sworn that the colony they built would know the difference between a seal and a wall. The rule had been the first casualty of the breach year. Its restoration had passed the assembly without debate, which the clerk noted was becoming a habit, and the night before the festival, work crews had done a thing that made even the children quiet. They had run maintenance on the Plaza Iris, the ceremonial door, servos unused for 12 years except by one trespasser. And at Domebright on founding morning, with 9,000 residents watching, the Iris had been opened on purpose, formally, to stay. Vex had stood the dawn watch herself that morning, by choice at the ops board, and she had permitted herself exactly one piece of sentiment on duty. When the Iris reached full dilation and held, she had checked the Doorgrid's event log. The system, rebaselined at last, calibrated now against truth, recorded the cycle in clean green letters. Plaza Iris. Open authorized. It was the first time in the file's 11 months that the word had appeared without her having to argue with anything. Now it was mid-morning, and the festival had the plaza, and the chief sealkeeper sat at her small table outside the arbitration hall with file 77 open to its last blank page, watching her security problem move through the crowd. He was not hard to track, he never had been. He went at his eternal, unhurried diagonal, the crowd's geometry bending around him not in fear now, but in the careless accommodation a town gives its oldest landmark. A hand trailed along his back here, a child lifted to see over him there, a stevedore salute, a baker's crust. He wore the festival garland the school had made him, lopsided, one ear through it, with the dignity of a creature who had been wearing ceremonial regalia all his life. He stopped at the fountain to drink, and at the south bench out of what Vex was now professionally satisfied was pure custom, since its permanent population these days ran to a dozen children, and the girl at the center of them held court there like a harbor master. And then he came, as he always came at mid-morning, across the plaza to the arbitration hall, and the small table and her. Officer, Vex said. The dog regarded the file, the table, and the chief with his torn ear up. Then he turned and lowered himself, joint by joint, across the threshold of the arbitration hall, the room where the colony took its quarrels, the room that had been booked solid for 11 straight years of separate grievances, and stood empty now 4 days in 5, and he sighed the sigh that stirred dust, and he slept, enormous and unbothered, across the doorway of the place nobody needed today. The plaza roared on gently, the way a healthy thing roars. By the kiln rails, Hadda Brim and Grell soon were arguing about barley, with the relish of women who intended to continue the argument for 30 years. At the apronside tables, Tomas Abel was teaching Garad Toll a human card game amid accusations of cheating that were themselves a kind of treaty. The lamps of the procession were already burning down the lower stairs, and at the head of the route, visible the whole length of the colony's spine, Davorin stood in his lampkeeper's sash. The assembly had insisted on a sash. He had complained about the sash at length to anyone who would listen. He was wearing the sash, with the widows of Lantern Stair flanking him and Imra Park checking his route lamps with a welder's eye. The choir was tuning at the fountain. The Iris stood open. The light came down through the dome the way it had come down on the first morning, bright and ordinary and unearned, the way the best things had turned out after all the file's evidence was in to arrive, before anyone deserved them, ahead of all proof, like a stray crossing an emptying plaza toward the one bench where he was needed, belonging given first and grown into ever after. Vex watched Etta Park detach from the bench crowd, cross to the arbitration hall, and sit down on the floor of the doorway, against the sleeping dog's shoulder, in front of the entire colony, as if it were the most natural furniture in the world, which, the file reflected, it was. The file had 90 entries on the subject. The girl looked up and from Chief watching her, and grinned the grin of the room's expert, and said, "You're going to write that down too, aren't you? You write everything down." "It's the job," Vex said. "What's this one going to say?" Vex looked at the last blank page. Around her, the colony she had spent 11 years guarding and 1 year finally seeing made its market noise, all of it, both rows and all 9 species and 41 humans and 1 lampkeeper, in one plaza, through one open door. She took up her stylus and found that the entry had finished writing itself some time in the last 11 months, and set it down in a sealkeeper's steady hand. Entry 91. Incident File 77 is closed. Final accounting, 1 stray canid, earthstock, designation latch, resident of the hole. 91 incidents. 0 injuries. 80 interior walls breached, none of them mine, all of them ours, and everyone needed breaching. The subject entered this habitat through 3 doors that should not have opened, and the assessing officer has concluded, on review of all evidence, that the doors were the only part of this colony that was working correctly. Threat assessment, he is the safest thing on this world. We were the hazard. Disposition, he stays. So do we with each other this time. File closed, doors open. She read it back once the way she read everything back. Then she stamped it and capped the stylus and sat in the bright fall of dome light outside the arbitration hall, off the clock by 2 minutes and not moving, while the festival went on and the choir found its note and the lamps came up the stairs, and the loneliest bench in Sunkage Terrace stood empty in the sun because everyone who had ever sat on it was somewhere better, and the great gray-muzzled keeper of all of it slept on his threshold in the middle of 9,000 neighbors, latched still, holding nothing shut, letting everyone in.